like to welcome you to the Golden Wings Flying Museum. It's a pleasure to have you guys here today. These airplanes are part of my collection. I don't really view them as mine. I only view myself as custodian of these airplanes for a period of time. But we try and preserve the airplanes and the history that surround them and enjoy sharing this as part of the responsibility of ownership with people who are interested. So welcome.
Well, first of all, flying airplanes is special no matter what kind of airplanes they are, but I enjoy the vintage aircraft because it kind of harks back to a bygone day, and you kind of imagine yourself sitting in the cockpit just as these pioneers of aviation have done. Well, I grew up in Ottumwa, Iowa, and that's the headquarters of the Antique Airplane Association. And of course, if you look around this hangar, most of the airplanes here are antiques. I think the bug bit me when I saw the old airplanes flying over at their annual convention in Ottumwa in the fall. Just when I was a little kid, I'd look up and I'd see all these biplanes and old monoplanes and open cockpit airplanes flying around. And another ride that I took at a young age was in a Ford Tri-Motor, and I think it's kind of like a baby duck. I think I kind of had an impression at that time and have been following and looking at and enjoying airplanes ever since. One of the airplanes that I have is a Ford Tri-Motor. Charles Lindberg flew that airplane. Amelia Earhart flew that airplane. The first man over the North Pole, the first man over the South Pole, the first air crew to fly from east to west across the Atlantic, all flew that airplane, and several other noted pilots. And to be sitting there in that seat is pretty phenomenal.
But this tri-motor here that we were just talking about is the oldest flying metal airplane in the world. This is the airplane that Charles Lindberg took Anne Morrow for her first airplane ride in. It's a very historic plane, oldest flying airliner in the world. It was the largest plane of its time to fly into Mexico and the largest plane of its time to fly into Canada. We have the set of skis for this airplane. After it left the United States in the early 1930s, I'm talking about 1932 or so, it went up to Canada and it was put on skis in the wintertime, and this is one of the skis for the airplanes. This is a more modern tire and wheel system that's on the airplane, but the original one is spokes. And these spokes were a little weak, so if the airplane landed hard, the spokes would break, and on occasion, the airplane would go down on its wheel and perhaps rub a wingtip or something like that. And these are the kind of accidents we try to avoid. So in the interest of preserving the airplane and being able to present it to people, rather than put the original tire system on it, we put a more modern system on so you don't have to worry about having an accident. When you restore an airplane, people ask, to what extent do you keep it as it was originally? And some airplanes are artifacts and we don't touch them. They are as they were when they came out of the factory, and if you restore the airplane, you'll destroy the originality of it. Then when you restore an airplane like that, you pick a point in time and say, that's what I'm going to restore it to. And you keep in mind what it is you want to use it for. So if you're just going to park an airplane in a museum and people are just going to come up and look at it, you might treat it differently than if you're going to take the airplane out and fly it across country. But by and large, this airplane is 95% of how it was when it came out of the factory September of 1927. This is one of the airplanes that we'll call an artifact. The construction techniques are so detailed, again from the early 1930s, that I'm afraid that if we tried to restore the airplane, some of the uniqueness of the construction techniques would be lost. This airplane we're standing in front of is the world's first diesel-powered airplane. But if you'll see here, behind this is the fuel tank, and they use kind of a bootlace method of covering the underside of the wing with fabric so that if they wanted to take the fuel tank out and work on it, they just pull this piece of tape off and undo the bootlaces and they could lower the tank. There are lots of interesting details like this in this airplane. For instance, some of the inspection panels actually have a zipper like you would have on your jacket that they unzip to look inside rather than having to cut it open or put a panel. This is just the aging of the fabric. Unfortunately, when I bought this airplane, it belonged to the Henry Ford Museum, but it was on loan to another museum on the East Coast. They were surprised when they advertised it and I gave them a full price offer, and I said, okay, I saw an ad for this airplane, I'd like to buy it. And they said, well, don't you want to see it? I said, I don't need to see it. I know that I want to buy the airplane. And they said, well, I'm not sure we can sell it to you. I said, well, you have the airplane advertised at X price. I said, I'm going to send you a check. The bottom line is I FedExed him a check and I bought it. And after I bought it, I asked someone to transport it back for me who was supposed to be an expert. But when he got it, he just threw it on the back of a truck, poked holes in it with his fist and strapped it down and hauled it back on a flatbed, and more damage happened to the airplane than has happened to it in 30 years, just getting it back here. And I said, what were you thinking about? He said, I figured you're just going to restore it anyway. I said, no, I wasn't going to restore it, and I'm not going to restore it. So bottom line is we put it back together. There's a little bit of damage from transport here, but it's an incredible artifact that preserves exactly what airplanes were built like in the mid-1920s. This is my friend Amelia Earhart, and she has something to do with the Avro Avian behind me. Amelia Earhart had a number of record flights, well, many record flights in her career. Her first record flight was one where she flew in an Avro Avian across the United States by herself and back. She went from Rye, New York to Los Angeles and returned. And in 2001, we celebrated Amelia Earhart's first record flight in the only flying Avro Avian in the world, which is this airplane right here. We followed the same route Amelia followed from Rye, New York, across the country, landing at the same places, staying at the same hotels when we could, eating the same food because Amelia kept a great diary of exactly what she did on that flight. And when we came to some of the stops, we had people coming out who had actually seen Amelia land the first time, and they ended up signing the wing of the airplane. She purchased this airplane from another aviatrix, Lady Mary Heath in England, when she arrived there in the Friendship, being the first woman to cross the Atlantic in an airplane. She wasn't the pilot, she was the passenger. But anyway, Lady Mary Heath sold her this airplane, and when the airplane arrived in the United States, after Amelia got back from crossing the Atlantic in the Friendship, there was this written on the side of it. To Amelia Earhart from Lady Mary Heath, always think with your stick forward, which means maintain the airspeed of the airplane. Don't get dawdling and stall it. And when we were going to recreate her flight, this airplane had to look exactly like Amelia's airplane. So we repainted it to be exactly as it was when Amelia flew it. And if Amelia Earhart were standing right where the camera is right now, my guess is she couldn't tell the difference. This is a Fairchild F-45. It looks like an airplane when it's finished, but right now it's obviously not finished. This is an example of the skeleton that forms the basis for the airplane. There's no fabric on the airplane, there are no controls in it, there are no cables, there's no wiring, there's no nothing. But this is essentially the skeleton of an airplane, and when you restore an airplane, if you're going to do a complete restoration, you take it down to this level. In fact, you take it down to a level even lower because this one has been restored and painted and is ready to begin the process of recovering. And I requested the drawings for this airplane from the Federal Aviation Administration, and they refused to give them to me, saying that they were trade secrets. We ended up filing a lawsuit against the Federal Aviation Administration requesting the drawings for this 1936 airplane, saying that there could not possibly be trade secrets in this that are still secret because it's a tube and fabric airplane. And to make a long story short, that case went to the Supreme Court of the United States and was heard by the 9 justices, and in a unanimous opinion, they said give them the drawings, essentially, and we now have the drawings for this airplane. The fact of the matter is, this is the only flying steel airplane in the world. This airplane is not built of aluminum. It doesn't have fabric except on the wings, but the fuselage and most of the body of this airplane is built out of stainless steel. The reason for this is that in the 30s there was a trend toward building airplanes out of aluminum instead of fabric. Well, the steel industry wanted a piece of the action. They wanted some of that business. They said, gosh, we've got to come up with a good example of what a steel airplane could really do. And so they commissioned the design of an airplane to be built out of stainless steel. Now this is actually thinner than it would be if it were made of aluminum and weighs less than it would were it made of aluminum. The biggest drawback is the steel is very hard to work with because it's stainless, and there are millions of little spot welds on this, and it's monocoque construction, so just tiny little skeletons behind these sheets of stainless steel that had to be shaped and then spot welded all over. It was so hard to do that it was never really a success. But the reason it's a flying boat is the steel industry said, now we're going to use stainless. So that's why this is an amphibious airplane, because stainless steel could withstand salt water as well as freshwater exposure much better than aluminum could. But in the end, the stainless steel was so hard to work with, it was not a success. They built 5 of these airplanes, and this is the only one left. This is kind of an interesting vehicle. It's in an airplane museum because it has a place in commercial air travel, believe it or not. This is a Fordson bus, and this was the world's first airport shuttle bus. Henry Ford had 6 of these built to carry passengers from the Ford Airport to the Dearborn Inn. Now, Ford Airport was built by Henry Ford as an airport for the Ford Motor Company and also for use when they did the National Air Tours, which were conducted from 1925 to 1931. What's interesting about the Ford Airport, which is in Dearborn, Michigan, is that it was the world's first paved airport, first paved runway. It happened at the National Air Tours of 1925 and 26 were coming back. They both came back in the rain, and Henry Ford was standing out, and at that time they just landed on grass fields, and he had mud up to his ankles. And he said, when we do this air tour again and have all these airplanes flying back to the Ford Airport, we have to fix this mud problem. And he came up with the idea of applying a little automotive technology to it. He said, let's pave a road for them to land on, and that was the world's first paved runway. And across from the Ford Airport, he built the Dearborn Inn, which was also the world's first airport hotel. So to carry his visitors from Ford Airport to the accommodations at the Dearborn Inn, he said, we need a bus to take them back and forth. So he had 6 of these Fordson shuttle buses built. So they would go back and forth from Ford Field to the Dearborn Inn, and this is one of them. And this bus has 1,600 original miles on it, and that's it. I set about looking for a Kreutzer Tri-Motor about 5 years before I finally found this one. I continued my research and was disappointed that none seemed to exist. Then I found that some Mexican nationals had purchased this airplane with the intent of restoring it and making a whole lot of money selling it to somebody as an original Kreutzer Tri-Motor. They were unsuccessful at that because they were unsuccessful in the restoration effort. The airplane looked absolutely nothing like it should have looked. It was built of barnyard plywood and 2x4s and was basically, I don't want to say a piece of junk, but it was not anything like restoration should be, and it was not airworthy aircraft either. So this airplane ended up in a storage bin in El Paso, Texas, more or less forgotten. I traced it down and was able to acquire it from the Mexican nationals who had owned the airplane and attempted to restore it. But it was built in Los Angeles, and this airplane has an interesting history. One of the things that it did is it spied on the United States in World War II, or right before World War II. It was sold to a fellow in Mexico who operated gold mines. He was a German national, and the Nazi government asked him to fly along the border of Texas and report back. But he flew it along the U.S. border and reported back to Germany in the early 30s. He was then thrown in jail and spent the rest of the war in a Mexican jail as a spy. But prior to going down to Mexico and working in the gold mine / spying business, it was in Arizona, and it flew as a feeder airplane for the Transcontinental Air Transport System. It was based in Arizona and flew from outlying communities. Prior to that, the airplane was based in Seattle and smuggled booze during Prohibition from Canada over into Seattle, the Seattle area. It did a lot of other things too, but those are some of the anecdotal stories about this very interesting airplane. Fairchild FC-2W2, another late 1920s airplane. This was built by the Fairchild Camera Company, which ended up being the Fairchild Aircraft Company, as a platform for survey photographs of the terrain of the United States. Basically, they had a contract to take aerial photography of the entire country on a grid, and they needed an airplane to do it. So they built a big, stable airplane, drilled a hole in the floor, and mounted their cameras. It's interesting because it has folding wings. At that time, an airplane with a 50-foot wingspan, they couldn't find a hangar to put it in. So they designed the airplane for the wings to fold back, and that way they could stick it in a barn as they were flying across the country doing their photo work. When I acquired the airplane, it was in Idaho, covered with aluminum. Right now it's covered with fabric, which is how it was originally built. A very interesting history of this airplane, and that was that it belonged to the National Park Service. In fact, it was the first airplane the National Park Service ever owned. Having worked in Yellowstone Park for 3 years, I said, wow, Park Service's first airplane, I'm going to put it back as it was when it flew for the National Park Service. It was based in Manteo, which is Kill Devil Hill, which is where aviation first began. And so I had the airplane restored in its Park Service colors, or livery as we call it, just as it was when it flew in Manteo in the early 1930s. After I finished the restoration, I continued to do the historic research on the plane and found out where the Park Service got it. Park Service was given the airplane by an outfit called NACA. NACA was the predecessor to NASA. And I then found out that this was actually NASA's first airplane. So I call it the predecessor to the space shuttle. But in any event, this was actually NASA's first airplane. But my Park Service buddies borrow this airplane every year to put it on display at Park Service events, and I'm happy that it is in Park Service colors. This airplane is a Waco biplane. It was built in the 1930s. I purchased it from a fellow in Santa Paula, California, who'd done such a beautiful job restoring it, I said I wouldn't touch it. But it has kind of an interesting history. It flew from horse tracks in New York to Havana, Cuba. So the gamblers would bet on the ponies, and they'd get in this airplane, they'd fly down to Cuba, and they would play in the casinos. It was a very fast airplane for its time. It travels almost 140 miles an hour, and it's quite luxurious. It's well upholstered. Actually, if you land the airplane and want to camp out, the back seat folds down into a bed. It's very interesting. I'll show you something on this airplane that a lot of people, including pilots, don't know about. If you look at this airplane, it has three holes, if you will, in the side of it. These are flares. So in the 1930s, a lot of airports didn't have lighting at night. So this airplane would fly over, and there's a switch in the cockpit, and you can launch a flare that's on a parachute out of each one of these individually. And you'd fly over where you think the field is, you'd fire one flare, you go halfway down the field, you'd fire another flare, and at the end you'd fire your third flare, and they would float down on parachutes. These are very bright, and as it descends, it would illuminate the field, and you quickly bring the airplane back around and land it before the flares go out, and hope that you don't start a fire in the grass in the meantime. This is another tri-motor, and this is a Stinson Tri-Motor. They built a high-wing version of this airplane, and then 5 or 6 years later they built a low-wing version of the airplane, which is also in the collection. This airplane belonged to several different airlines. One of them was American Airlines, and it is American Airlines' oldest flying airliner. This airplane belonged to several different airlines. Among them was Century Airlines, based in Chicago. They sold it to Chicago and Southern Airlines, which merged ultimately into Delta. But when American owned the airplane, it flew out of Chicago to Detroit and the areas in the upper Midwest. And it is today the oldest flying American Airlines airliner. And people ask me, they say, are you afraid to fly these old airplanes, these old tube and fabric ships that have been around for 75 years or so? I say, if they're well maintained, it's not a very great risk. And in fact, this airplane has over 1.5 million miles and has carried more than 100,000 passengers. And that's documented because we have the logbooks of this ship going back to the day it was built. It also is flown as a cargo plane, and in fact is a bush plane in Idaho. And when we got the airplane, this door was about twice as large as this. It was a big double hinge door that opened like this. And it actually carried horses in the backcountry of Idaho. So they go land on these backcountry strips, and to get the horses out before winter set in, they'd anesthetize them, they'd fold their legs over, put them on a pallet, and carry 1 or 2 horses per trip in this airplane. They'd fly them out of this backcountry in the Sawtooth Mountains where they couldn't possibly have gotten out otherwise. It's done a lot of things and been a lot of places, and now I'm so happy to have it here as part of the collection. This is a flying car. This flying car was designed by a fellow named Molt Taylor. After World War II, you know, everybody was, yeah, we can do anything, and we can make flying cars, and we can have nuclear power provide all of our electricity forever, and everything was going to be great, and everybody was euphoric about stuff. And Molt Taylor said, I'm going to build a flying car. He's one of the few people, in fact, the only person at that time to be successful in his efforts to build a flying car. So this car was built in 1954, and this airplane was built in 1954. And it can be driven on the highway. In fact, when I bought the flying car, I had to have separate insurance for driving as a car. So I have car insurance, and I had to get aviation insurance for flying as an airplane. It drives on the highway, and you can pull in and put the wings on it. It takes 20 or 30 minutes to attach the wings, and you can go out and fly it as an airplane. Somebody says, what is it like to fly? To be honest with you, I've not flown this one. But the 2 pilots who've flown it, they've said, it's not a very good car, not a very good airplane. When I bought it, it had been flown 750 hours. It's got like 16,000 miles on it, so it has been used both as a car and as an airplane. The steering wheel functions as the airplane yoke. And the only modification we've done to it is put a louder horn in it. The fellows that have flown it have fly it at air shows, and they fly over the crowd and honk the horn. And it goes beep, beep, but pretty loud. Kind of fun. Very interesting concept, and people are fascinated by it, even today, of course. Humankind has always looked up at birds and said, I wonder what it would be like to fly. And that has been a dream and an obsession of people for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And only in the last 100 years have we been able to realize what it's like. So we're really in a special time where we can actually go up and have the experience that untold millions have looked up and wanted to do since time began for humankind. So I think that's a very special part of flying as well. But when you go out and look for old airplanes, you oftentimes end up talking with old guys, and they're almost always characters. And they always cry when the airplane goes. This is terrible. I'll probably cry if one of these airplanes goes.